In Kentucky, local activists are getting increasingly frustrated with State Attorney General Daniel Cameron, who has yet to confirm if his office will be presenting evidence in the Breonna Taylor case to a grand jury. It has been nearly 6 months since Taylor was shot and killed by 3 Louisville police officers who have not been charged. This week, Cameron released a statement dismissing reports that his office was ready to present its findings. In it, he warned against rushing to judgment, saying any news about the still ongoing investigation will come from him. So with me now from Louisville is Hayes Gardner. Hayes, you're a reporter for the Courier-Journal covering all of the Breonna Taylor protests. So thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with AG Cameron. He's seen protests, several of them, some of them on his front lawn. Protesters, are they growing impatient with the Attorney General? And what do you expect to see from protests if he does not bring charges against the officers soon?
Thanks for having me on. And yes, protesters are certainly impatient. Today would be the 107th day of protests since May 28th. And the most consistent, most tangible cry from protesters is arrest the police. And they want these officers arrested. They're impatient with the process and with Cameron taking so long with this. It's hard to predict what will happen if the officers are not charged. Some protesters say that they aren't sure how everyone will react. They're determined to stay peaceful. They're worried that there could be a repeat of the first weekend. And so a lot's up for debate as what will happen, but it could come soon. It seems in the coming weeks we'll have an answer, and we'll see how the protesters react.
Earlier this week, 2,700 white women wrote a letter to Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher demanding that he listen to black women and fire the officers involved in Taylor's death. Is this indicative of the support that Louisville is giving to black women? Is there a newfound focus on some of the challenges that black women face in the city?
I think there's certainly a newfound focus on that. I think this movement has played, an incredible role in that. I also think that this letter from white women, both in Louisville and nationally, I think it's indicative of the movement as a whole. Historically, racial justice movements have been primarily populated by black people, and that's how it was in the 60s and in other times. At protests here, it's majority black people, but there are a lot of white people, a lot of people of all races. So I think that this letter is indicative of how the protest has support across different racial groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation when you sort of put it in the context of the protests that we are seeing across the country. When people say it feels different, you remember particularly when there were more protests going on, you heard a lot of people saying this feels different than it did the last time. And I think that's part of it, that what you see is sort of a interracial coalition taking to the streets to protest. We've certainly seen Taylor's mother leading several protests this summer. What has her role been, and how has her voice been lifted during these demonstrations?
She's present at the protests occasionally. She's not there all the time. She's more of a private person, but she's been at large protests. She's even been at the smaller protests. And protesters are quick to support her because a lot of protesters say to me, I see myself in Breonna. It could have been me. So I think people relate to Tamika Palmer and relate to Breonna Taylor's story because they fear that it could be someone they love. So I think it's a personal connection for many people.
So you wrote an article detailing how many of the attendees of the live stream protests are dealing with hate speech. This is what has developed into a new norm, right? It's a different way of protesting. Tell us more about what you found and if the experience is different, sort of being in person versus live streaming.
Well, my colleague and I, looked into the live streamers because it's been such an integral part of this movement. The first day of protests was kind of propelled by live stream. The first night, a few people were protesting. Live streams went out, and people in Louisville joined joined the protest because of the live streams. And then since then, there have been live streamers there every day. There are about 10 or 12 consistent live streamers who stream video on social media that thousands across the country watch, and it's constant video. And there are people who consistently watch the video every single day, whether it's a massive protest that results in arrests or whether it's just a march of 30 people downtown, which occasionally it is what the protest is. So it's been a huge part of this movement, and the live streamers, they're sympathetic and supportive of the movement, which means that on social media, some people who are not supportive of the movement will get on the comments and with some hate speech. And some have said that they've even received threats and death threats. So it's an interesting, it's interesting how important live streaming has become to this movement, in that sometimes the march, I was there the other night, the march won't take off each night until the live streamers are present, so that people can tune in.
That's really interesting. And I think the other another kind of interesting component of what we're seeing has been the way professional athletes have been speaking out now, both on and off the field. They were doing it before, but now, the professional organizations that they work within have kind of embraced their voices. The NFL kicked off their season yesterday, and they took into account the demands for racial justice. We saw Naomi Osaka wearing Breonna Taylor's name on her mask, as well as others. But I wonder about, how significant it is to have these high-profile individuals raising up her name, because, at the beginning, Breonna Taylor's story was very, very local. It had not risen to a national level. And even once there was a familiarity on the national stage with her story, it was still being overshadowed. But some of these more high-profile individuals have kept her name in the public eye, even as things seem to be sort of moving at a glacial pace locally.
Sure. It's been really interesting to see how pro athletes and athletes have responded. I mean, we've seen colleges in Kentucky post statements. We've seen the pro leagues take a very, outspoken stance on it. In the NBA, there's been many NBA players have said Breonna Taylor's name, advocated for justice for her, including LeBron James. The other day, Jamal Murray, a player who went to the University of Kentucky, he choked up on national television talking about Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, who he had their faces on his shoes. And in the WNBA, Angel McCoughtry, a University of Louisville, former University of Louisville basketball player, she pushed the WNBA to allow Breonna Taylor on the back of their jerseys. So it's been a huge push from the pro leagues to keep Breonna Taylor's name and other victims of police brutality at the forefront, and I think that's essential to the movement. I've heard from a historian that policy doesn't change when the protesters push for it. Policy changes when public opinion is shifted by protests, and athletes with large platforms pushing for changes and for racial equity is a huge part of this movement.
Hey, just before I let you go, I have to ask you about the Kentucky Derby, because there were protesters there as well. But the difference is COVID, and there were no spectators, or very few spectators. I wonder if that protest even had the impact that it would have had if, you had these images of people demonstrating while you had, all these people sort of coming to the track in these fancy hats. And I imagine the image would have been particularly jarring, but this year we didn't see any of that.
Sure, it was strange. It was the strangest Derby probably ever, because there were no fans. I was inside the track, and I should say there were no paid fans. There were a few fans who were friends of owners, things like that. Very few fans inside, but outside there were hundreds of protesters. There were actually multiple demonstrations. One by a black militia on the front side of the racetrack. One at the back of the track. by a group of local and national groups, and there were a few hundred chanting there. And inside the track, you could kind of see the protests. Would have been more, apparent had there been fans there, had there been interactions between the fans and the protesters. A lot of people have asked me why protest the Derby. It's a racetrack. It's not a courthouse. But it's been in the past, people have considered protesting at the Derby because of the platform that it provides. It's the biggest event in Louisville and in Kentucky, and so that alone gives it it's a megaphone, if you will, for the protesters. And then secondly, a lot of Black people in Louisville don't feel like the Derby includes them. They feel like it's an event that excludes. So they, don't see it the same way that many maybe wealthier white Louisville residents see the Kentucky Derby.
That is really interesting because, so these protests have really expanded, not just focused on police brutality, but certainly and the individual cases that they are seeking justice for, but also all the other areas where we see inequality that we've kind of just taken for granted. So it totally makes sense when, the way you answer that question about why protest the Kentucky Derby. Hayes Gardner, thank you so much.
Thank you.